Welcome to the Flash Finds podcast, the world's fastest podcast where we explore how Facebook can help you with the stuff you're into. I'm Emma Rogue, joined by Nathan the Cat Lady, a Facebook creator. So Nathan, if you're into pets, what kind of stuff can you find on Facebook?
Well, I make reels about useful tips for pet owners. For instance, cats don't like still water, so all of my cats have cat fountains.
Oh my gosh, that's so cute. What a great episode. See you next time on the Flash Finds podcast, all about discovering the stuff on Facebook you care about. Bye.
If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss, ask your question or leave a comment on our voicemail at 800-815-6820, and we might just include your message in an upcoming show. The next time you're shopping for mountain bike gear, check out singletracks.com/deals. Each week, we share our favorite product picks and exclusive coupon codes from our partners. You can also use the page to search for whatever you're buying, from complete mountain bikes to brake sets and tire sealant. That's singletracks.com/deals. And to get our weekly picks delivered to your inbox, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Links to the newsletter and deals page are in the show notes. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Jenny Corso. Jenny is a cyclist and R&D scientist who has studied exercise nutrition and physiology through various undergraduate, graduate, and PhD programs. She's also a licensed USA cycling coach and has written many articles for Single Tracks on topics including fitness, nutrition, and travel. Thanks for joining us, Jenny.
Hi, no problem, Jeff. This is wonderful. Thank you.
So, how did you first get into cycling and mountain biking?
I actually wrote about this in a Single Tracks article on Chico a while back. I kind of attested to a mix of BMXing in middle school and high school with a group of friends that, I had growing up. And then I kind of lost that in college and, I went into the military, and then I ended up leaving active duty and moving to Chico, California back in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And I was running a lot. I was really fit because of, my time in the military. And then I ended up getting an injury and hurting my foot. And one of my first friends there, Shirley, she introduced me to two guys, Tom and Colin, who had been mountain biking forever. And they kind of got me into it. They introduced me into the sport. And, for me, with a hurt foot, I had a stress fracture in my foot. It was something that didn't bother my foot, and then something I could also enjoy, with the adventurous part, and then maintaining my fitness and things like that. And I just kind of dove in, and, I found my group of friends there, and I never looked back on anything else. I think it was the sense of community in the sport, something I was used to, in the military and in other sports I had done. It was, a great sense of people within the mountain biking community. And it was a really good way to absorb life through the outdoors and then the community of Chico. And it was a great place to live. And I feel like it was a nice culmination of all the things I was looking for, based on my kind of lifestyle and things I was interested in and whatnot. So it was kind of a perfect storm of things, I guess, that happened.
Yeah, you've got it all in your story. You've got the outdoors, you got community, and then also the fitness aspect of it.
Right.
Did your passion for the sport sort of lead you into your later studies and your career within nutrition and physiology, or was it something else that drew you into sort of science and those types of things?
I think it was a combination of a couple things. I always had a really big affinity for chemistry growing up. My great-grandfather was a chemist. I found that I really enjoyed chemistry and biology in high school, thought about studying it for my undergraduate degree, and then instead of being, an 18-year-old like, oh, I'm really good at this, it was more, I tested out of this, I'm going to go into something else.
Yeah.
So I think getting into sport and in fitness in the military, and then being a really large fan of bikes growing up and cycling and the adventurous part, traveling around with my parents, was just a big part of growing up with my dad. And then, I kind of coached soldiers. I got into helping some of the soldiers that struggled, with their physical fitness aspects. That kind of got me interested in the coaching aspect. And then when I left, I started grad school in taking chemistry classes for pharmacy school, actually. And when I moved to Chico and started taking some of the prerequisites I needed for pharmacy school, I ended up meeting two faculty there, Jack Azevedo and Steve Henderson, both exercise physiologists. And again, that was another perfect storm moment where I'm like, oh man, I can nerd out on metabolism and biochemistry, apply it to sport, fitness, and physiology, and then become a better bike rider, pass the information along to students and other athletes. And I totally just found my calling. I think it was just, again, a wonderful setting and time in my life where things kind of fell into place.
Yeah, that's really cool how you're able to bring those two together. So one of your research interests is exploring the differences in exercise metabolism between men and women. So I'm really curious about this. I mean, biologically speaking, do men and women have significantly different nutritional needs?
Well, it's kind of complicated when you look at it. You can look at it from just a basic metabolic or physiology point of view, and then you can apply research and the concepts going along with exercise physiology. Mm-hmm. So evolutionarily, there is a reproductive requirement for body fat in females to remain, 12 to 15% or higher in a healthy range, because women need that to biologically activate estrogens for reproduction and to maintain bone mineral density. So it's really difficult for women to lose fat and alter their body composition in any lower percentages. One, because it's unhealthy and genetics just kind of doesn't allow for that. There's a slew of researchers that got into researching all of this from an exercise point of view. Ron Courtright, Ann Friedlander, Mark Tarnopolsky, Greg Henderson, Glenn Gazer, some of the more notable metabolic researchers that looked at sex differences and fuel use during and after exercise. So, and this does all tie into nutritional needs, because, how you fuel your body and then what type of exercise you're doing based on if you're a male or a female, it does change. So Ron Courtright did an animal study a while back he used rats, but animal studies are the foundation for human studies, so they're completely applicable in that sense. He took two groups of rats, males and females, and found after 9 weeks of self-selected exercise, the females had higher caloric deficit, so they burned more calories during their self-selected exercise, yet the males still had a lower body fat mass overall. So that kind of was a springboard into other researchers looking into, okay, why is this happening? Yeah. Does it have to do with hormones or catecholamines, other hormones that could come into play that dictate, fuel breakdown, fat mass maintenance, and things like that? So Mark Tarnopolsky, for example, he looked at fuel use during exercise, and Friedlander as well. Mm-hmm. He did an interesting study where it was known that females had an increased fat use during exercise. So they like to self-select using fat more than males would in comparison. They both spare glycogen use, but females tend to spare glycogen breakdown or, glucose use more than males. So he did an interesting study where he gave 17 beta estradiol, or the biologically active form of estrogen, to men to see if he can mimic female fat use during exercise. Yeah. So more fat burn, less amino acid use, so protein breakdown and glycogen use. And he found that there was no alteration between male and female glycogen use, but the men did tend to change after estrogen administration, the amount of fat they were using. So they did burn more fat. So it did tend to mimic more female tendency for fuel use during the same type of exercise. So, looking at certain studies like that, we can kind of dictate that biologically higher amount of estrogen that females produce kind of dictates female fuel selection, specifically fat and free fatty acid use, lipid breakdown in women during exercise. So you could take that further, and researchers started looking at, okay, what about post-exercise, during recovery, immediate, and then, over the course of 24 hours or a few days. So there's the concept you're probably familiar with, EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So that's the period of time when you go on a bike ride for an hour, you're going to have this period of time where you need to replenish anything that you use. So any glycogen stores that were broken down to release glucose for fuel use. Same with fat or any amino acids that may have been used to convert into glucose or things like that for exercise. So you can do work. Catecholamine release is important as a part of to dictate what fuels are used and what is being replenished afterwards. Mm-hmm. So this is a part of anabolism, or replenishing the stores that were used during exercise. So researchers got into that to see if there was a sex difference between men and women. So Orange Theory, for example, has this theory, the fitness studios, where they kind of jump on this concept saying, okay, you have a window after exercise where you're going to burn an excess amount of fat.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a difference between men and women. Mark Tarnopolsky, Greg Henderson, a few other researchers at UC Berkeley dove into this, finding that there is a major difference between men and women in duration, regardless of duration of exercise and intensity. So they looked at a variety of intensities and durations of exercise and found that men will have up to 24 hours of excess fat burn versus women, which kind of caps at about 3 hours, and then it goes back to resting metabolic rate. So that's a big difference.
Yeah.
So you can't apply the theory of, if I exercise, I'm going to continue to burn fat for a certain amount of time, the same to men and women, because it is different. And it kind of goes back to that need to re-esterify and store fat for women for reproduction. So that whole evolutionary dictation of fat mass maintenance in women. So differences in nutritional needs. Absolutely there is. So there are 6 different classes of nutrients, and you can look at it from a macronutrient standpoint, so carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and then also a micronutrient need, so vitamins, minerals, and then you have the need for water and phytochemicals and other things like that we know are beneficial and necessary to continue living, essentially, let alone do sport. So in general, men need more macronutrients, basically because they have more mass overall. They're just bigger than women, and generally more lean muscle tissue mass. Therefore, they have a higher basal metabolic rate. Healthy men do in comparison to women because of these 2 things. So they're going to need more calories overall just to sustain life day to day.
Yeah.
Throw in physical activity on top of that, and then, you're going to have a higher caloric difference there. Mm-hmm. It's understood that women may need more micronutrients, calcium, iron, folic acid in particular. Healthy women, a higher need for folic acid in reproductive age. Iron, women are more predisposed to anemia than males, so iron is important. Postmenopausal women, especially due to less estrogen, calcium needs are higher to maintain bone mineral density. So you have that little bit of difference there between men and women's needs for micronutrients. For the athlete, I think it depends on the purpose and the goal, including a body composition goal. So if you have a man versus a woman that is trying to change your body composition, that's an athlete, it's going to be more difficult for the woman to lower her body composition, right? Especially when you're taking into power to weight ratio and things like that. There is going to be a healthy threshold that women shouldn't cross. Mm-hmm. In a scientific, I guess if you could say scientific opinion, that's kind of an ironic statement, but just because of reproductive capabilities, you lose too much fat, then you can compromise that. And, if you're suffering from amenorrhea as a woman, you need to think about your bone mineral density too. Throw in the fact that cycling is a non-weight bearing exercise. It's important to think about those things. So I think for the athlete, the purpose and the goal as well is going to dictate what you consume. And then, a good coach is going to take into account, okay, I have a female versus a male. How do I go about maintaining a healthy body composition, changing body composition in a way where we're not compromising nutritional needs, meeting adequate nutritional needs, making sure there's adequate protein intake for men versus women based on their body composition, mm-hmm. what gains they need to make, am I parsing out my macros appropriately, making sure, iron intake is adequate for the females, electrolyte balance, things like that. So do you have any questions specific?
Yeah, well, it sounds like, if I could summarize and sort of recap, it sounds like the big difference is how men and women convert certain stores into energy during exercise in particular. And so it's less about what you have sort of in your system at the time, but it's more about what you have before you start the workout. Is that accurate to say?
That's true too. You do want to make sure, if you have a hard training session coming up, of course, depending on what the training session is, a couple hours before you want to consume, 5 grams of carbs per kilogram. And then an hour before you want to make sure you consume carbohydrates too. So, you have free glucose available for work.
Right.
Fat, you're going to break down from adipose tissue or intermuscular triglyceride stores. So it's not as essential that you're consuming fat, but especially with males too, you have a predisposition to break down protein from muscle tissue into amino acids for fuel if you don't have an adequate amount of carbohydrate available. Where women don't necessarily have to worry about that as much because we can break down fat. We have more fat, convert that in the liver to glucose. Whereas, males that have a really low body fat percentage do have a higher risk of catabolizing protein during a workout. So proper carb loading pre and during exercise is absolutely important for reasons of just being able to maintain power output. And then also, you have the male versus female reasons too.
Yeah. Interesting. So we talked about exercise metabolism, and I want to ask you sort of how that's separate from just everyday metabolism. I mean, I think most of us are familiar with the term. We may not know exactly what it means, but we've definitely heard it and know that it's sort of a factor in how you break down nutrition and also how you gain weight or lose weight. So how specifically, though, is sort of the nutritional need different for athletes versus someone who's just sort of living their life every day?
Okay. Everyday metabolism, I think you could describe as just a balance between what your body uses through fuel catabolism or breakdown and what it processes through anabolism or constructive metabolism and the storage of fuel. So when you eat, the food that you eat is going to be broken down into, the three smaller components that you store. So glucose into glycogen, triglycerides will be broken down, free fatty acids, and they'll be stored in adipose tissue. And then protein will be broken down into its amino acids forms and stored. And that's kind of the basics of that. And in periods of fasting or during exercise, for example, you're going to be breaking down that stored fuel and using it. So catabolism, let's talk about that for a second. That's, your basic metabolic rate plus any activities of daily living, you're going to be breaking down fuel. And anything you burn sleeping, periods of fasting for protein synthesis to maintain muscle mass or build more proteins for whatever you need them for. Your body uses them for everything, essentially. Fuel you use to digest the food itself. So you actually burn calories digesting food. So that's catabolism.
Is that like people used to say that grapefruit has negative calories? Is that what they're talking about, where it takes more to break it down than it actually has in it?
Yep. Celery, the same thing. Yeah. So it's like 5% of your calories can be allocated to what you use to digest your food in a day, if you look at your basal metabolic rate overall.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, it's kind of good. You can add all this stuff up and figure it out. Kind of based on your weight. If you can have a really, really, really vague estimate. If I weigh 130 pounds, I can assume about 1,300 calories roughly is my basal metabolic rate for a healthy adult. So yeah, you need calories to stand, talk, chew gum, rake leaves, all of those things. So anything stored, you can break down to do that in any periods of fasting. So anabolism would be the opposite. So after you consume food, digest and absorb all the fuel, it's delivered to muscle, your liver, adipose tissue for storage and for use later. So your everyday metabolism is a balance between catabolism and anabolism. And then, if you go into calorie deficit or on a low calorie diet or things like that, where you're burning more fuel than you're consuming, exercise aside, then you have a higher balance of catabolic activity. You're going to change your body composition that way. So that's kind of the basics exercise out of it. There are exercise metabolism in there, and you can kind of change the focus a bit to the catabolic form of fuel breakdown in order to do the higher rates of work that exercise requires, because it's a stress on your body. It has a similar response in catecholamine release, cortisol response, things like that as other stressors. In that sense, where fuel is broken down in preparation in a flight or flight way, but you're choosing to do it for health reasons or as an athlete to compete and things like that. And then, of course, there's a recovery period where you're breaking down fuel to replenish those things until you consume more food. So the nutritional needs associated with exercise metabolism is going to be dictated by a principle called the FIT principle, and then recovery needs, nutritional timing, and then, what part of the season you're in too. You're going to eat differently off season than you are in the middle of race season. So the fifth principle is just the frequency the intensity, time, and type of exercise you're doing. How frequent are you exercising or training? What's the intensity of the type of training you're doing? Because you can look at marathon bike racers and you can look at downhillers or free ride mountain bikers, and it's a completely different way to train.
Right.
Different nutritional needs. So that's really important. You're going to use fuel differently based on the type of exercise you're doing, the muscle recruitment patterns you're having, the type of muscle composition you have based on the type of athlete that you are. And then recovery, I think, is as important, if not more important than training, in the sense that if you don't recover, you can't train. So that's something you need to take into account. So the nutritional needs of your recovery periods in between, and then overall recovery.
Yeah.
So any athlete needs to eat for their training sessions, of course, pre, during, and post, and you have to take immediate recovery into account, adequate carbohydrate loading post-exercise, along with protein, and then long-term recovery too.
Yeah.
I think periodization, of course, needs to be taken into account as well. Nutritional needs will change based on, what block you're in of training, around race season, before racing, during and after racing, if you're in season or out of season, if you change environments. So if you're traveling to altitude, you're going to need a higher carbohydrate need. If you're going into a hot environment, higher carbohydrate need, more hydration needs, higher electrolyte requirement. Your macros could change based on the type of exercise you're doing. Again, like the marathon racers versus, downhill racers. And then the age and fitness status too, male versus female. So your fitness status is, obviously going to dictate how much fuel you're going to use based on, your muscle composition, and then your age too. So someone that's, 50 or 60 that's racing is going to have a different nutritional requirement than, a 20-year-old that's either just getting into it or at the peak of what they're doing at the time of their life. So those are all things that a good coach needs to take into account. And then the athlete themselves should be familiar with all of these things and how they feel. And if you're craving sugar and you're an athlete, you probably need to eat some more sugar. So it sounds simple, but there are some simple things like that where you should pay attention to what your body's telling you too.
Yeah, I like that. So moving beyond nutrition, let's talk a little bit about food. So it seems like we're always hearing about new studies regarding the health or the unhealth of certain foods. And often this seems like it can be contradictory. 1 week we'll hear coffee's good for you. The next week we'll hear it's bad for you. So how do you look at these studies, and what's sort of the best way to take all this into account when making decisions about what to eat?
It is really hard, especially looking at fad diet advice, which is propelled by the internet age and the access to information. Personally, I take the time to read multiple perspectives because I know there's always more than one perspective,
right?
Especially when it centers around new diets and new diet advice. So this is the best diet for athletes because of X, Y, and Z, even though it may contradict something else that may have been around way longer. And there are always foundational nutritional targets for athletes. I think it's important for people to take the multiple perspectives into account and consider how new information is. If it's something new and it's blowing up in the media, consider the source and the reputation of the information. So everyone's familiar with like the grain brain and wheat belly stuff. There's books that came out on it. Does the actual journal science support what is being stated in the media or on forums in those books? And if yes, then take the information seriously. If not, or you're finding more conflicting information than supporting information, then I would heed diving into it and changing your lifestyle based on, something that's new. Yeah.
Was the newness, do we already have a pretty good idea about nutrition and diet and exercise and how that's all related? Or is this a field where you're seeing a lot of like rapid growth and change in our understanding?
I think there's both. I think we have a good foundation understanding diet and health. However, you can compare like the diet of the Inuits being heavy in saturated fat, and then the French diet, for example, they drink a lot of wine, they eat a lot of carbohydrates, and they have a lot of saturated fat in their diet. Yet their risk health-wise for cardiovascular disease is way lower than in the Americans and here in the United States. Same with Italy. You have people that are proponents of a low carb diet, yet in Italy, 50% of their diet is carbohydrate based. So you have that conflicting information culturally, yet you have differences in chronic disease rates. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? And a lot of that's based on the physical activity of the populations you're looking at. And you have older cultures that, have cities that are built around walkability and things like that. And then you have the age of the car and the way we do things here that may be different, and some cities aren't at all. You can live in downtown Boston maybe, and you live in an area where you can walk or ride your bike and you are physically active just in your day-to-day activities, versus other places that aren't built like that, or you live in a rural area and you have to drive an hour to work, or you live in San Francisco and you can't afford to live downtown. So you have a commute where you're in your car 3 hours a day, which is normal for some people, and you don't have that time for physical activity. So diet becomes important.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent for food over supplements. I think if you can get your nutrition from food over taking supplements like vitamins or supplements like, unless you need to for dietary reasons or health reasons, you're going to get a more natural source of macro and micronutrients from food. Yeah,
I was going to ask you about that. So, I mean, we were talking about nutrition, and obviously you take a very scientific view of it, in terms of the proteins and the carbohydrates and things like that. But it sounds like you also advocate real food over, powders and drinks and pills and that sort of thing. Right. If you think the source of food is if it's natural food and like not processed food that is fortified with a lot of things, and that's a whole nother podcast. Right. But if you think about a healthy, balanced diet, so one of the most researched diets is the Mediterranean diet, and people have been talking about this for a long time, but the American Heart Association considers that to be one of the most researched and healthier diets for heart health. And if you think about cardiovascular disease being the number one cause of death for both men and women in the United States, it kind of makes sense that you may want to pay attention to what the research supports with that for health. Yeah, there's fat in that diet. Yeah, there's whole grains, fish. They even consider consuming small to moderate amount of wine or beer as a part of that diet when you eat, to be part of the healthfulness of the diet. So if you look at the research behind that and the activity of the people that consume that in the area where that diet is, in the Mediterranean coast, they're a very, very healthy group of people. So they're not relying on supplements to give them health per se. They're relying on a balance of, again, nutrients and food and, their lifestyle overall to lend them to having a good long life in the sense of health. If you apply this information to athletes, of course, the needs of the athlete needs to be considered too. Any special considerations, personal or cultural, disease related. If somebody does not want to consume meat, things like that, you may need to obviously consume supplements as an athlete, extra protein, make sure, the diet is structured well so they aren't lacking in, say, a protein need or something like that. Frequency of training, the seriousness of the athlete, access to certain foods, and socioeconomic status. Everybody would love to consume organic produce, organic meat, but some people can't afford to do that, and that's just the reality. Right. Some people don't have access to local markets and things like that, or certain foods. So that needs to be taken into consideration by any coaches and the athlete too, to figure out how they can still consume a balanced diet and what they consider a balanced diet, and any cultural things they want to include in that too, because everybody's different and has a different background and different belief systems. So right. It's way more complicated than just saying, here's a good diet, here's a bad diet, because there's a lot of conflicting information, good and bad data, good and bad studies. Yeah. Well, let's talk about one specific thing that's gotten sort of a bad rap lately, and that's gluten. So you've written about this on Single Tracks and on your website as well. Mm-hmm. Is gluten bad for athletes or people in general, or is there something else going on? I can't say gluten is bad. If I were to
say gluten itself is a bad thing, I'd be lying.
Well, it is delicious, so it's got that going for it.
It's delicious. You can buy bags of gluten, extra gluten at the grocery store. So it has a purpose. It's found naturally in wheat, barley, and rye for a reason. It's just part of the structure of those particular grains. It's interesting kind of how it came about in the evolution of being another one of those things that grew exponentially quickly in the media. And then, people follow things out of fear sometimes without, and the research takes a long time to catch up.
Yeah. To be fair, I mean, there are people that are highly allergic to it, I guess is the way you would say it, or sensitive to it. And then people have tried it as well. They've gotten it out of their diets and they say they feel better. And so,
sure. Yeah,
it does seem to have some credence.
It is. There is a lot of conflicting information in this particular topic. And it's still interesting to see how strong the topic is in kind of mainstream nutritional media and discussion too. Because sometimes you'll hear things and then they go away right away, and other times they don't. And this is definitely still discussed all the time. Is it bad for people in general? I think people can choose to eat whatever they want. Of course, it's up to them what they want to eat, what they believe is good for them, and what they believe is not good for them. And barring diseases like celiac disease, IBS, which the jury is out on whether gluten does something good or bad for people that suffer from IBS. Crohn's disease, leaky gut syndrome, indirectly related autoimmune disorders. If you have a wheat allergy, obviously you can't consume wheat, so your gluten intake is limited outside of things like, barley and rye. But then you can look at cultures, again, like Italy, which has a high carbohydrate consumption, and they don't have nearly the rates of some of these diseases, but that could be a genetic difference in the wheat itself. So the genetic difference in wheat grown in Europe is substantially different than a lot of the wheat that's grown in the United States, even though they import a lot into Europe from the United States. But you hear of people going to Europe and consuming, wheat-based products there, bread, things that are locally made and grown, and they can consume it, even if they have an allergy. And then they come back here and they can't anymore. So that's the plant genetic difference. It's kind of an amazing thing if you think about it, related to gluten or not. I think to play devil's advocate against the gluten thing, it's bad for your pocketbook. There is some evidence that shows there is a placebo effect associated with it. And then, you have the concept of elimination diets, which can lead to more harm than good sometimes. So if you look at the price, a lot of gluten-free foods are upwards of 300 to 400% marked up. Even on foods that don't naturally contain gluten. I've seen bags of fruit labeled gluten-free, and fruit doesn't have gluten in it.
Right. Oh my goodness.
But it's a great marketing tactic, and marketers are good at selling things if they're good marketers. So there's a gentleman, Alan Levinovitz. He's a scholar and professor in ancient Chinese religion, and he wrote a book a few years back called The Gluten Lie. And in his book, he goes through fear-based diets and regulation or elimination of certain things that people were generally consuming. And then he dives into whether or not good evidence-based science supports, the elimination or regulation of these things. And one of the things is gluten, obviously, and he heeds in his book. If you haven't read this, I suggest reading it. It's just a good perspective that be careful of the people putting out the information versus making a huge dietary change. Yeah. Because elimination diets, if you're a generally healthy person, you don't have any chronic disease, it's not necessarily recommended for a healthy person to eliminate an entire food group. If you're eliminating gluten, you're eliminating wheat, barley, rye. Not that you're not eating rice or oats or other things that naturally don't have it, but you can miss out on a lot of important micronutrients or underconsume macronutrients like carbohydrates if your diet isn't balanced or constructed properly after eliminating, say gluten-containing foods. Trading one problem that isn't necessarily a problem for another, is the risk versus the benefit worth it if you're not careful on how you do that, especially as an athlete. I mean, some athletes may find it more difficult to attain carbohydrate needs if they're not careful in reconstructing their diet after eliminating gluten-containing foods. You know, a decently serious cyclist, you suggest they consume 50 to 65% of their macros from carbs.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's a lot. That's the majority of their diet. It's not half, at least. So they need to make sure they make up for removing wheat and those things and other types of carbohydrates and sugars, especially before and after exercise, anything around any training session or race, because if they're under consuming, especially males, they can catabolize muscle tissue. You want to make sure they're fueled, for maximum power output. So, and then obviously recovery is important. So people, personal choice to remove it if you feel better, that's awesome. If you have a disease, obviously you have to not consume that, but just be careful people need to be careful where they get their information and, they balance their diet properly. A lot of people will remove foods or follow diets and then also make other lifestyle changes too. And all of those factors together may give them more of a benefit than they would just if they took out one thing. So that needs to be taken into account also.
Well, yeah, eliminating gluten for a lot of mountain bikers would mean no pizza and beer. So I think some of us would go very hungry.
Yep.
So one of the studies I've always found interesting links calorie intake restriction with increased lifespan. And obviously athletes in training need to take in a lot of calories to fuel themselves, which is really, that's the opposite of calorie restriction. And I remember this came up when we were talking with Mark Weir about how when he was training and sort of doing this, he did this 1,000,000 feet of climbing challenge one year. And, he's burning 5,000 to 7,000 calories a day and obviously needs to fuel himself a lot. So, what are your thoughts about this? We tend to assume that athletes live longer than others, but could this increased calorie consumption be bad for us? And if so, is there anything we can do to sort of mitigate it?
That's it. It's interesting. It's an interesting perspective. There's been a lot of research put into different theories of aging, and intermittent fasting and caloric restriction is one of the big theories of aging in reference to metabolic rate. So you decrease your metabolic rate to a certain point, and you can better regulate your immune system, decrease carbohydrate use, and therefore the thought is you can increase lifespan to a point. Overall healthier life. Exercise impacting the immune system as well. There's obviously research that supports, people that do a moderate amount of exercise, moderate intensity exercise most days of the week, as recommended by the Surgeon General, the AHA, ACSM. Mm-hmm. It's good for your immune system. It's good for your body in general to move, as does caloric restriction in the sense of intermittent fasting and things like that for similar reasons. So you can kind of look at them in a similar way to a point. So the study that you linked through discussing improved P38 regulation and FOXO proteins, I can explain that a little bit for the listeners. So FOXO proteins help dictate glucose metabolism. When they're optimally regulating what they regulate, which is a slew of things, you have a reduction in carbohydrate use during periods of fasting. They regulate your cell cycle, so reproduction and death of cells, so that whole cyclic growth and death of cells throughout your lifespan. Energy balance, they regulate oxidative stress resistance, so resistance to lysing and death of cells due to oxidative stress. They regulate tumor suppression, regulate risk of cancer, lower your metabolic rate, decrease appetite, and the theory of aging that suggests a lower metabolic rate can increase lifespan with credibility because of what we know through, protein regulation and genetic regulation based on some of this stuff. So they have looked into, okay, so how does exercise, is there a certain amount of exercise that is the best?
Okay.
And there's several studies that point to Moderate intensity exercise is the best for immune response and longevity. Prolonged endurance exercise, so it's like a kind of like a bell curve.
Yeah.
Prolonged endurance exercise, frequent heavy exertion may lead to increased risks of infection for 72 hours. It's called the open window theory. So it kind of counteracts the benefits of, say, fasting or moderate intensity exercise with this open window where your risk of infection goes up if you're doing prolonged or frequent heavy exertion for a long period of time. Studies show a suppression of macrophage resistance to viral infections, for example, within that window. Decrease natural killer cell cytotoxicity activity to prevent infection and things like that. So it is definitely a balance. Moderation is key in almost everything, exercise included. So it goes back to, okay, how much are you doing? Are you recovering from this? Especially if you're on the opposite end of the bell curve where you're practicing prolonged endurance exercise for a long period of time without taking off seasons or, properly constructing blocks and then training sessions within those blocks of exercise.
I like how you sort of tied that into intermittent fasting, because that's another thing that seems to be becoming more popular. We're hearing more about that. And it doesn't seem like it's a great thing for athletes necessarily, but it is kind of related, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of related. I think it depends on goals too. A big focus in cycling, for example, power to weight ratio. I mean, you always want to be careful not to compromise recovery and therefore lean muscle mass gains, because you're not consuming enough protein or carbohydrate for synthesis and gains from what you just did and worked your butt off for, right? Especially for males, which have a higher proponent for, muscle catabolism if, carbohydrate intake isn't high enough. Same with enough of other macronutrients to not continue muscle catabolism, for amino acid conversion to make up for inadequate carb and fat consumption. So if you are fasting to a point where you're not consuming enough to make up for what you burned during exercise and used, and then for recovery, in order for you to make gains, muscle hypertrophy, replenish any stores that you use, then you could be in a negative deficit, and then you risk overtraining and all the stuff that goes along with that, and that's a whole another bad area to find yourself in.
Yeah, interesting. So clearly, nutrition and exercise go hand in hand in terms of health. But does one win out over the other in terms of outcomes? I know for me, I'm very active. I bike and run and commute by bike to the office every day. And so I burn a ton of calories, but I also drink Mountain Dew. And that doesn't seem like it's the best thing. But I always tell myself it's okay because I exercise. But is that fair to say that one is better than the other? You can sort of make up for doing the wrong thing on one side by focusing on the other?
There's a lot of interesting research in this area. They're both obviously important, right? Mm-hmm. For health, and then obviously to fuel exercise. Bad diets can be partially ameliorated by exercise, in particular aerobic exercise. So I don't necessarily think a good diet can make up for a sedentary lifestyle. We have standing desks now, or breaks, moderated breaks throughout the workday for reasons. Plenty of studies show benefits with controlled caloric intake for different types of diets, healthy and unhealthy. And then, looking at, okay, this group of people was sedentary, and this group of people got, a 10-minute break every hour, and this group of people were able to move around throughout the workday. And then, if you control the diet, and even in a healthy diet, the people that move the most, generally speaking, have the best, lipid profiles and things like that, regardless of, not regardless of the diet, but it's the exercise groups typically win out.
Yeah. Huh.
The one thing you don't get from a diet is just the sheer stress within your vasculature. So sheer stress is kind of taking a look at the way blood flows through your vasculature. So when you start exercising, blood flow increases. So the velocity at which the blood flow increases puts an extra stress along the blood vessel wall, which can lead to a cascade of benefits in response. So you're going to have decreased E-selectin response and therefore a decreased tendency for things to stick to the blood vessel wall. And so therefore a decreased plaque buildup and then a decreased risk for atherosclerosis. So moving around is a benefit in that sense. And that's something you can't get from diet per se, because movement does one thing, diet does another thing. Now, obviously, if you have a healthy diet and you're not consuming a bunch of terrible things, then that's a benefit too. And that, that's obvious. But there were a couple of interesting studies. Dr. Kim Huffman in 2012 published a study looking at vigorous exercise having positive effects on lipid profiles in sedentary populations when they consume diets that varied from American Heart Association healthy diet guidelines. So they looked at low density lipoprotein or LDL cholesterol, particle number and density. So both of those proponents are important in understanding LDL levels being healthy or unhealthy in a person. And then HDL or high density lipoprotein, which people, you can consider a good cholesterol, and then your triglyceride levels. And so they found that even with a varied diet and diets that weren't necessarily within healthy guidelines, according to the AHA, there were still positive effects on all these lipid numbers when these sedentary individuals were conducting vigorous exercise. There was another study in 2013 published in the Journal of Applied Physiology where, the study pretty much stated that regular physical activity can ameliorate any pathophysiological effects, so negative symptoms of high-fat diets like glycemic control, visceral fat accumulation, just by regular physical activity. So that's not going out and riding your bike for 2 hours. That's, taking a walk for 45 minutes. So there's a lot of support for, exercise kind of combating negative effects, or, you can drink your Mountain Dew all day and ride your bike enough. You're probably okay, as opposed to somebody that doesn't ride a bike.
Right. But it's still not the optimal, right? I mean, I'm sure there's something better I could be putting in my body than Mountain Dew.
Yeah, there are not many calories in Mountain Dew, Jeff. or excuse me, nutrients in Mountain Dew. There's a lot of calories, but empty calories.
It's plenty of yellow number 5. I think that's a vitamin, I'm pretty sure. So what I hear you saying through almost all of this is that moderation is key, both in exercise and nutrition. So I'm curious, though, is there an example of anything sort of in the nutrition or exercise world that doesn't fit this mold? Is there anything that we can just go crazy on, whether it's a food or an exercise or something like that, or does that not exist?
I had to think about this, and I don't know. I hate to say that, but that's my honest answer.
Yeah, it sounds like for the big ones, I mean, exercise, it's not about going out and, just running 100 miles every night.
Yeah.
If that's not good for you, then nothing is.
There is always a balance. I wish I could think of it's off of the top of my head. There was a gentleman, I remember reading an article about a gentleman that takes 100 pills a day. Oh,
right. Yeah, the Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah, in a sense to see if he could live forever. And so obviously that's an excessive thing to do, and he's not going to live forever because 100% of us die. So
well, he hasn't been wrong yet. He's still alive as far as I know.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have the extremes like that, and is it doing something good for him? That's an interesting question. So is there something that you can eat all of or do without moderation? That I don't know. I mean, I know things like, we're even questioning the need for multivitamins, and that's been around for a while now. Excess antioxidants, can, for athletes can cut gains because they're combating necessary signals. Consuming vitamin C and vitamin E post-workout, which a lot of people do, is going to, kill the signal for your body to, grow mitochondria and have mitochondrial biogenesis. So that's a common misconception that, eat a gram of vitamin C after exercise is going to help your gains. It's actually going to do worse for you. I already kind of talked about getting macro and micronutrients from food over supplements. A lot of people will take supplements to make sure they are getting enough of something.
Right.
But if you have a balanced diet, shouldn't need to do that outside of maybe, more protein. Like I take protein supplement, I take BCAAs, I'll take a pre-workout depending on what I'm doing every once in a while, but that's about it. There are naturally occurring enantiomers. It's chirality of molecules. It kind of gets into the biochemistry, but the biologically useful version of a molecule, like D-alpha tocopherol versus L-alpha tocopherol, you're going to get both in a synthetic vitamin E versus naturally sourced vitamin E from, say, salmon, or, L-isoleucine versus D-isoleucine. Your body uses L-isoleucine and the L versions of most the essential amino acids. So you don't want to consume the other because it's not really useful in the sense of what it requires to build proteins. So there's that part of it. Overeating or undereating, imbalanced macros, too many antioxidants, not consuming enough electrolytes with water. You can overconsume water and become hypovolemic, which is not necessarily a good thing. You've heard of people dying from that.
Yeah.
Carbohydrates may be one thing people don't consume enough of. Ketogenic diets and power, for example. Outside Magazine actually published an interesting article in 2016 on physician Tim Noakes from South Africa, who kind of fathered this concept, pushing for a low carb or a ketogenic diet. Obviously for like ultra runners and things like that, it's a great diet. For someone that requires power, there have been studies that don't support that diet for somebody that's a sprinter or something like that, or somebody that requires carbohydrates or creatine, phosphate to provide them with bursts of power, just because your muscles don't do that. You know what I mean? And then, of course, the exercise bell curve relationship, overtraining.
Yeah, it sounds like everything has a bell curve, basically. I mean, there's like the optimal amount, and you can go too far on it, and it's could be detrimental to you. Right.
I mean, when it comes down to it, exercise or not, training or not, being an athlete or just trying to be healthy, at the end of the day, everybody ages. It just depends on how quickly you want to age. How long do you want to prevent onset of chronic disease, through cellular protection and positive feedback loops, affecting antioxidant transcription factors, that's higher in athletes. As body adapts to conditions of exercise, it's subjected to, you need to fuel that to remain healthy, because you can exercise and not fuel yourself properly. It kind of goes back to your previous question. And then you can go into overtraining or being malnourished. And then, what gains you're going to get from that? What's the point in the end?
So it's probably safe to say that most adults know generally what good nutrition looks like. But why do you think it's hard for people to get it right and to eat healthy? Do you think it's easier today to eat healthily than it has been in the past?
I think it's easier to eat healthier today because people have access to information. They have access to healthier foods, locally grown foods, farmers markets, things like that. Absolutely. I think some difficulties may arise from like burdens of societal expectations, push for competition, performing a certain way, looking a certain way. There's also the death of the expert. And I say that in a way that, there's access to information, which is great, but at the same time, there's an overwhelming amount of information on the internet, and people don't know where to get their education, because you can educate yourself, but based on what you're educating yourself with, you could be completely miseducated too. So people used to rely on experts, hiring a coach, registered dietitians. Not that they don't anymore, but a lot of people will do their own research, and there's a lot of forums out there and a lot of research out there that don't necessarily cite good information or good studies, or, and it's harder to learn how to read research studies. So most people don't go to, JAP or, British Journal of Pharmacology or something like that, because it takes practice to learn how to read that. And, they rely on books and other people to be truthful, and even some of the books are founded on poorly researched or under-researched claims, or written by people that aren't necessarily experts in a field, yet anyone can pass a personal trainer certification. You have nutritionists that call themselves nutritionists that may have taken a nutrition class, but they're interested in it and they like it. or coaches that pass down information because it worked for them, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're educated in a way that they are passing down, the best educated information to others. So there's positives and negatives to the information aspect. I think that there's a difference between eating healthy and then consuming for performance too. And it's difficult to delineate maybe what you need from where you're starting off. Like I started mountain biking and getting into cycling, and I was already really fit. And there are other people that just want to get into the sport to just become healthy, and maybe they're sedentary and they're going to need to fuel themselves differently and look at food differently than I may have had to day one on a bike. So asking yourself maybe what your goal is can put you in the right area to start off in, and then you build habits from there. If you just want to enjoy riding and enjoy food, then enjoy riding and enjoying food, and don't waste money on supplements unless you need to for a health-related reason. If you're really serious, then consult a coach or an RD, get a good, food-based plan together that follows training periodization. That's what I would recommend, and it'll help you put you in the right direction. And then, a lot of people worry so much about the tiny little things. And unless you're a higher level athlete, higher level competitions, it could take the enjoyment out of riding in the first place. So you can always keep that at the forefront. Like, why were you doing this in the first place? Because it's fun and it kicks ass. So
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, after our conversation, though, it's clear to me, I guess my hope, and maybe what a lot of people hope, is like there's an answer, right? That, somebody will tell you this is what you should and this is what you shouldn't. But based on our conversation, it's more obvious to me than ever that it is complicated because everybody's different and everybody has different needs and different requirements. And so it's not the type of thing that you can do like a one size fits all solution for. Everybody's they got to do some of the research themselves, or at least find someone that they trust to work with and help them figure it out.
Right. Yeah. Asking questions, reaching out to a coach, or, somebody that's been doing it for a while. If you have a friend that's been cycling for a long time and you say you want to get into it, or if you're, more serious, then reaching out to a coach or someone that has access to a coach is always easy. And there are mathematics and there are recommendations. I mean, how much you should be consuming based on what you're doing. Like a well-trained athlete we know can store up to 24 grams of glycogen per kilogram muscle, plus another 100 grams or so in the liver. So we know based on those numbers how much carbohydrate the athlete should be consuming overall, based on stores, and we can figure out, okay, what do they burn in each training session, and then what do they need to do to make gains? So based on, their racing goals and their season. Same with protein. To throw more numbers out there, you have, athletes consuming 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight for typical athletes, or that would be about 70 kilograms or 155-pound male. So that's about 150 grams of protein. So that's another target you could think about. And then, what's left over is fat. So that's about 20 to 30% of fat, depending on the type of athlete. So like a marathon mountain biker, someone doing 24-hour races and things like that would be different as far as their fat requirement and their recovery needs than, someone again doing, shorter races or downhilling or something like that. So an example would be like a 60-20-20 diet. So 60% carbohydrate, 20% protein, 20% fat. And that's the macros, but it'd be a good place to start for somebody that doesn't have any base at all in this. And then, they can adjust their macros after that. And another thing people forget about is hydration, because that's just as important as what you're consuming as far as food, especially with electrolyte balance. And it's not just sodium and potassium. You're losing calcium and magnesium through sweat, and those are important anabolic minerals to help recover at night. So, all of that needs to be taken into account, especially if you're serious. In order to progress.
Very good. Well, yeah, thank you so much. I know I've learned a ton, and I'm sure that our listeners have as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. This is great.
So if you want to learn more or find out how to connect with Ginny, you can check her out on her website, truephiz.com. That's TRUPHYS.com. And you can also search Single Tracks for some of the articles she's written over the years. That's all I've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.